Step out of the vehicle. Why were you speeding?
It's an emergency. My wife needs help.
Sir, put your hands behind your back.
What? She's bleeding.
You're being detained. Turn around.
Officer, please.
Hands behind your back.
The inside of a car on a Thursday afternoon has a particular quality of ordinary, the kind of afternoon where nothing is supposed to go wrong. The sun was pretty high and white over Meridian Avenue, the kind of October day that hadn't gotten the memo about autumn. Adamola Jackson had been in the driver's seat for less than 3 minutes when the blue and red lights appeared in his rearview mirror. The dashboard clock read 2:14 p.m. Becky was in the passenger seat, one hand pressed against her abdomen, the other gripping the door handle with the kind of stillness that isn't calm but controlled panic. She was 8 months pregnant. She had called out to Adamola from the bedroom in a voice he had never heard from her before, quiet, flat, stripped of everything, and since then he had been on the move, highly tensed. Adamola was not a man who rattled easily. 6 years in the United States Navy, 3 combat deployments, and a clearance level that most people in that county didn't even know existed. He had navigated situations that made a midday drive to the hospital look like a grocery run, but the sight of Becky shaking hands and the dark stains spreading across the seat beneath her had dissolved every instinct in him except one: to get to the hospital by all means necessary. He pulled over because he had no choice. He lowered his window because he thought it would take 30 seconds. He looked at Officer Walt Hornet's face when the officer leaned into the afternoon sun and swept a flashlight across the interior, and felt before a single word was spoken that, no, this was not going to be 30 seconds. He was absolutely right, and what followed is the kind of true crime story that makes you put your phone down and sit with it to the end. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you're watching from, and make sure to hit that subscribe button because what this police officer did and what happened to him afterward is something you need to see for yourself. The body cam footage begins mid-approach. The time was about 2:15 p.m. Afternoon light floods the frame. Hornet's hand is already visible at the edge of the shot, reaching toward the driver's window before his camera has fully steadied. Cars are slowing down while some are drifting past, the way a debtor intently avoids their creditor when payment is overdue. Inside the car, Adamola has both hands on the wheel, while Becky is in the passenger seat, one hand pressed to her abdomen, her head tipped slightly back against the headrest. She is wearing a gray maternity top, the one from the thumbnail that the internet would later see 100 million times, and her face has the particular blankness of a person managing pain in silence. Hornet leans into the open window. His flashlight, strange and unnecessary in the full light of a Thursday afternoon, sweeps the back seat, then the passenger seat, then lands on Adamola's face. That alone already suggests mischief. Have you been drinking today, sir? There it is, the word that will appear in Hornet's incident report 3 hours from now and collapse under the weight of evidence almost immediately after. Becky's voice comes through, thin and careful, begging the officer to let them go. Hornet does not respond to her. His body cam shows the passenger seat, shows her, visibly distressed, and he turns back to Adamola, ordering him out and then cuffing his hands. Adamola's composure breaks, not into rage, but into something more frightening in a man trained to stay calm in active combat. Hornet reaches through the open window. His hand finds Adamola's left arm, the arm that 2 seconds earlier was gesturing toward his wife. The door swings open. Adamola is pulled sideways, half out of the seat, trying simultaneously to stay upright and not leave Becky alone in a car with a police officer who has decided that his ego is more important than a bleeding pregnant woman. He does not fight back. He is too trained for that. But he does not go fully limp either, because compliance means turning his back on Becky and every instinct in a man who spent 6 years being the last line of defense for the people beside him. Hornet interprets hesitation as resistance, as he always does. The handcuffs click in the bright afternoon. Adamola's knees hit the concrete curb as he was forced to kneel. Hornet keys his radio. His voice is calm, like a mischievous thermostat, flat, functional, entirely indifferent to temperature. Dispatch, I've got one detained. Send backup. Not send medical. Not possible obstetric emergency. One detained. Backup. A rideshare driver named Millard Burke, idling 2 car lengths back with a fare already canceled and his hazards on, had been watching for 90 seconds. He picked up his phone. He would later tell investigators he started recording because something about the officer's body language in the bright afternoon light, the absolute absence of urgency, reminded him of something he'd seen before. He couldn't name it exactly. He just knew. Inside the car, Becky pressed her forehead to the warm glass of the passenger window. The world outside was vivid and ordinary. She could feel the edges of her vision beginning to soften. She did not call out again. She had heard what Hornet said into his radio. To understand the full weight of what Officer Walt Hornet did on that Thursday afternoon, you have to understand who was on each side of that car door. Walt Hornet joined the Columbus Police Department 9 years before this traffic stop. His early performance reviews were unremarkable. Average scores, no red flags, the kind of file that doesn't demand attention in either direction. But within 2 years on the force, a pattern had begun assembling itself in complaint records that no single supervisor owned long enough to recognize as a pattern. The first complaint came from a 19-year-old named Ricardo Andrews, stopped, searched, and made to sit on a curb for 40 minutes while Hornet ran his plates 3 times. No contraband, no charge. Andrews filed with Internal Affairs. The complaint was marked reviewed and closed, no action taken. Hornet was not even informed it had been filed. The second complaint, 18 months later, came from a 44-year-old accountant named Ernest Ragsdale, who'd been pulled over on his way to a school board meeting. Hornet had accused him of driving erratically, refused to explain what specific behavior he'd observed, and searched the vehicle without consent. Ragsdale's attorney submitted a formal objection. Sergeant Kenneth Wallace, Hornet's direct supervisor, handled it internally. There is no record of any disciplinary proceeding. The third complaint was the one that briefly made noise. A 17-year-old pulled from a car at a gas station accused Hornet of slamming his head against the hood of a patrol cruiser. There were no cameras on that side of the lot. 3 officers on the scene corroborated Hornet's version. The teenager's mother hired an attorney. Internal Affairs recommended a 3-day suspension. Hornet served it, returned to full duty, and within 5 months had received a commendation for a separate arrest. 3 days. A commendation. Back on the road. Nobody in the institution paused long enough to read those 3 complaints as a sequence. Nobody asked what they looked like together. Nobody connected the demographic pattern that any outside observer would have flagged inside of an afternoon. The institution, through 9 years of careful inaction, had told Walt Hornet something without ever saying it out loud. You can keep doing this. Ademola Jackson, however, grew up in southwest Columbus, the second of 3 children. His mother, Maribel Jackson, ran a home daycare and worked a Saturday shift at a dry cleaner for 6 years to keep the family stable after his father's contracting work dried up. Ademola got into the Navy at 19, qualified for SEAL training at 21, and completed 3 deployments before transitioning out at 26 with a record so clean and a clearance so deep that his federal contractor job offer came before he'd fully processed his discharge paperwork. He had been trained to assess threats in fractions of a second. He had been trained to stay calm when the cost of panic was other people's lives. And when he pulled over on Meridian Avenue that afternoon, he did both, calmly, clearly, without a single act of aggression. That is the man Walt Hornet accused of drunk driving while a pregnant woman bled out in the passenger seat. Here is what the footage shows, in order. At 2:12 p.m., Ademola's car reaches 62 miles per hour on a 45-mile-per-hour stretch of Meridian Avenue. He has been driving for 3 minutes. This is 1.4 miles from Columbus General Hospital's emergency entrance. At 2:14 p.m., Hornet's bodycam activates. The timestamp matters. It activates after Hornet has already exited his cruiser and is already mid-approach to the vehicle. The first 8 seconds of the stop, Hornet's initial visual of the car, his approach, and any preliminary assessment are not on his camera. Department protocol required activation before exiting the vehicle. That 8-second gap would later be described by civil rights attorney Jeffrey Ramirez as the most expensive 8 seconds in Columbus PD history. What the body cam does capture, Becky Jackson, in full afternoon daylight, visibly distressed, medical tape on her left wrist from an earlier prenatal appointment, a hospital tote bag on the back seat, partially unzipped, with a Columbus General intake folder visible at the top, a stain on the front passenger seat that a forensic medical examiner would later characterize in writing as consistent with obstetric hemorrhage. Hornet's own camera swept over every single one of those details. His own footage proves he saw them. He never asked about any of it. What he asked about, in order, the reason for speeding, whether Ademola had been drinking, license and registration, whether there were weapons in the vehicle, and whether Ademola had been drinking, the second time, slightly louder. He asked the drinking question twice. He did not ask the medical question once. He did not address Becky directly at any point. When she said, "Sir, I feel dizzy, please let us go," his body cam shows his head rotating fractionally in her direction, an acknowledgement with no content behind it, before returning to Ademola. That moment, that rotation, that is the 11 seconds Ramirez would later replay without comment before a Senate subcommittee. Ademola told Hornet he was a federal contractor with prior military service. Hornet told him that was irrelevant to the stop. Ademola told Hornet his wife needed a hospital. Hornet told him she could wait for the ambulance he had not yet called. He had not called one. When Millard Burke's phone footage was cross-referenced with the dispatch log, investigators confirmed that Hornet did not request medical assistance until 9 minutes into the stop, after Becky had gone silent, after Ademola's voice had broken through the sustained discipline of a 6-year special operations career and become something raw and uncontrolled. 9 minutes for a woman hemorrhaging in a parked car under an October sun, on a road 4 minutes from a hospital, while a 9-year officer of the Columbus Police Department conducted a DUI investigation that the evidence would prove within days had no basis in fact whatsoever. The ambulance arrived 7 minutes after Hornet's call. Becky Jackson coded in the back of it. The FBI field office in Columbus did not receive the call about Becky Jackson from the hospital. They received it from Ademola. He made it from a waiting room chair at Columbus General at 4:47 p.m., still in the gray hoodie, the one that had by then been photographed by 3 different news outlets, while Becky was in emergency surgery and their daughter was being stabilized in the NICU down the hall. His federal contractor status meant he had a direct line. The agent who picked up, a woman named Shauna Caraway, 14 years in the bureau, took the call, listened without interrupting, and spent the next 40 minutes on the phone to 3 different offices before the shift changed. By the time Hornet sat down to write his incident report at 5:30 p.m., 2 things had already happened that he didn't know about. The first, Millard Burke had posted his phone footage to 3 platforms at 3:45 p.m. with a caption that read simply, "Columbus, Ohio, broad daylight, pregnant woman." He called it a DUI stop. It had been viewed 800,000 times by the time Hornet finished his report. The second, the DOJ Civil Rights Division had requested Hornet's full personnel file, his stop record for the prior 36 months, and the body cam footage. The request had Shauna Caraway's name on it. Hornet's incident report described Ademola as uncooperative and combative during a lawful traffic stop. It described a strong odor of alcohol detectable from outside the vehicle. It described Becky as a passenger who appeared uncomfortable but showed no signs of acute medical distress at the time of the stop. It described Hornet's conduct as consistent with standard DUI investigation protocol. Then investigators opened the footage. Strong odor of alcohol. The footage showed a man speaking in coherent, measured sentences with the car windows down in midday October air. Uncooperative and combative, the footage showed a man with both hands visible, producing identification when asked and stating clearly that his wife was having a medical emergency. No signs of acute medical distress. The footage showed a visibly shaken woman with medical tape on her wrist, a hospital bag on the back seat, and an audible statement that she was dizzy and needed help, in full, unambiguous daylight. Every line of Hornet's report dissolved on contact with the light of his own camera. Then came the impossible discovery. A paralegal named Ruby Hernandez pulling Hornet's internal file for Ramirez's legal team found a 4th complaint, one that had never appeared in any public record of Hornet's history, filed 14 months earlier by a woman named Cheryl Plummer, who had been stopped while driving her sister to a dialysis appointment. Cheryl described Hornet detaining her brother-in-law for matching a description, despite the man being visibly in a medical transport bracelet. The complaint had been filed correctly, routed to Sergeant Kenneth Wallace's office, and marked "reviewed, no further action" in Wallace's own handwriting. There was no record of any review, no interview, no documentation of any kind. Cheryl Plummer became the 5th victim. Kenneth Wallace became the 2nd name on the federal investigation. There's a specific quality to accountability when it finally moves on someone who has spent years believing it won't. It doesn't announce itself, it just arrives, thorough, unhurried, and completely indifferent to the person's surprise. Hornet was placed on administrative leave 48 hours after the incident, not because the department moved quickly, but because Millard Burke's footage had made the choice for them. 3 million views by Friday afternoon, 2 city council members calling for suspension before the department's communications team had drafted a statement which, when it finally arrived, described the incident as under active review, did not name Hornet, did not mention Becky, and did not use the word pregnant. Jeffrey Ramirez filed the federal civil rights lawsuit on Adamola's behalf 19 days after the incident. The complaint named Hornet, named Wallace, named the Columbus Police Department, and named the city of Columbus. The claims covered excessive force, deliberate indifference to serious medical need, pregnancy and disability discrimination, falsification of official records, and a 9-year documented pattern of racially motivated misconduct that the institution had actively chosen not to address. The city's legal team requested a meeting with Ramirez within a week of receiving the complaint. They had seen the footage. They had seen Burke's video. They had seen Hornet's incident report sitting next to what his own camera had recorded in broad afternoon daylight. There was no jury in the state of Ohio that was going to side with Walt Hornet. The termination letter came 6 weeks after the incident. It was 5 pages long and specific in the way those letters only get when the evidence has already closed every available exit. It cited, individually, by date, by incident number, every failure the department had buried since Hornet's second year on the force: the falsified incident report, the fabricated alcohol observation, the 9-minute delay in requesting medical assistance for a visibly hemorrhaging pregnant woman, the body cam protocol violation, and the pattern. 4 complaints, 5 victims, 9 years of supervisory inaction.
He appealed. The appeal was denied in 11 days. Kenneth Wallace was demoted and stripped of supervisory authority. Every complaint he had received, reviewed, and quietly buried was formally re-entered into the institutional record it had always been owed. He would spend the following 18 months under federal administrative review, the weight of 5 suppressed files now permanently attached to his professional name. The settlement arrived at 5 months, $9.2 million. It required body camera activation reform across the entire Columbus PD, mandatory bias training and obstetric emergency protocol for all field officers, and an independent civilian review board with genuine investigative authority. As a personal, non-negotiable condition of the settlement, Walt Hornet was permanently decertified as a law enforcement officer in the state of Ohio, not reassigned, not suspended, done. Adamola Jackson appeared before a Senate Judiciary Subcommittee 4 months after his daughter came home from the NICU. He spoke for 38 minutes without raising his voice once. He described the sound of Becky going quiet in the passenger seat while he sat in handcuffs on a sunlit curb 4 feet away. He described what it felt like to be a man trained to handle anything, and to be made completely helpless by an officer who chose a DUI narrative over a human life in full afternoon daylight. His testimony was entered into the congressional record. The $9.2 million civil rights settlement, a federal misconduct finding, and a permanent law enforcement decertification, that is the only professional legacy Hornet has.
11 months after the afternoon he sat in handcuffs on a Meridian Avenue curb, Adamola Jackson drove the same route again. Same time of day, near enough, just past 2, the October sun doing the same thing it always did, indifferent and bright. Becky was in the passenger seat. Their daughter was in the rear-facing car seat behind her, at that particular age where silence in a moving vehicle meant either deep sleep or intense study of the ceiling. Becky had a coffee cup from the place on 5th that she always ordered from when she wasn't pregnant, which she now was not, and she was watching the street go by with the expression of a woman who has been through something that would have broken most people and decided to keep going anyway. They drove past the spot on Meridian where the stop had happened. The pavement looked exactly the same, ordinary and hot and indifferent to what had occurred on it. Neither of them said anything. Adamola's hands stayed steady on the wheel. Columbus General's emergency entrance was lit the same way it always was in the afternoon, that particular flat white that means the building is open regardless of what kind of day you're having. Adamola pulled into the visitor lot. They were there for a follow-up with Becky's OB, rescheduled twice and finally happening on a Thursday, which felt to both of them either like a coincidence or like exactly the right day.
Near the entrance, new signage had been posted on a corkboard beside the check-in desk, a laminated card in a dark frame that hadn't been there before. It read, "If you or someone in your vehicle requires emergency medical attention during a traffic stop, you have the right to clearly state the nature of the emergency. Officers are required to assess and respond to medical emergencies before completing standard stop procedures." It had come out of the settlement. Quiet, specific,
unglamorous, the kind of reform that doesn't make the evening news but might, on some ordinary Thursday afternoon, actually stop something. In the ambulance bay, visible through the glass, a new dispatch protocol was posted. 4 sentences, plain language. The 4th sentence read, "A stated medical emergency takes priority over all other stop procedures, regardless of the reason for the initial stop." Ademola read it on the way in. He didn't stop walking, but he read it. The appointment took 40 minutes. Becky's numbers were excellent. The doctor used the word thriving twice, once for Becky, once for the daughter, currently asleep in the carrier on Ademola's chest, small and warm and entirely unaware that her arrival into the world had triggered a federal investigation, a $9 million lawsuit, and a reform process that the Columbus PD was still working through. On the drive home, the daughter made a sound from the back seat. Not crying, not fussing, just present and awake and apparently curious about the sunlight coming through the rear window. Becky turned around and smiled. Ademola kept driving, his hands, as always, steady on the wheel. If this story moved you, don't just sit with it. What happened to Ademola and Becky Jackson was not invisible. It was captured on a body cam, a dash camera, and the phone of a man between fares who pulled over in broad daylight because something felt wrong. The impossible discovery, a buried complaint sitting in Kenneth Wallace's files, marked resolved when nothing had been resolved, is what transformed a violent, fabricated traffic stop into a federal civil rights case that reached the floor of the United States Senate. Without that footage, Becky Jackson is just a woman with a medical complaint in a story no one can prove. Without Millard Burke pressing record on a Thursday afternoon, it disappears into a department that had spent 9 years making things disappear. Share this story and subscribe now, because the next case ends in a way nobody sees coming, and the person at the center of it has been waiting a long time for someone to pay attention.